This week I'm going to show you guys how I recreated that sort of older Paramore style, more misery business era. We're going to go over how to stack vocal layers, how to make more of a drum-centered mix. I'll show you how I edit large groups of vocals to fit together perfectly, and how to have really present guitar layers without them being too grating on the ears. But before we jump into all that, let me introduce myself. Hi, my name is Seth. I work as a freelance music producer under the name Velvet Year, and I do one of these videos every Friday to show people how to produce their own pop music at home. Songs I've either written or produced have been featured on these Spotify curated playlists, and I did an entire album through Warner Music Group. So if you gel with the vibe that I have, and you just like to take a load off of yourself as a songwriter and offload all the production responsibilities onto somebody else, check out the top link in my description. All right, with all that out of the way, let's actually go to the song. So the track I'm going to be showing you guys today is called Cross My Heart, Hope to Die by the band In The Mourning. I highly recommend you check them out. I will leave their links in the description down below. So let's start working through all these layers. Let's start with the vocals, because I don't get vocals often on my channel. So this song has a lot of vocal layers. Like in total, there's about 25 tracks. I really wanted to make sure we were getting that sort of in-your-face vocal sound. So I've separated them into sort of three general categories. This first track I would call like the main vocals.
Cross my heart, hope to die. Rather be gone than be alive.
These vocal takes turned out really well. Amanda was actually able to come and track these with me in person, and I'm so happy with how they turned out. Mixing chains on these kind of change depending on what the purpose of the vocal is. So for this main vocal chain, I started out with a little bit of C4, which is just a multiband compressor. I personally like using multiband compressors for the most part at the beginning of my chain. Almost like a de-esser, it can kind of tame some of the inconsistencies tonally that are happening in the vocal before you go into your mixing chain. After that, we're going into some Slate VRM, doing some drive on this channel, going into their new FGDS, which is a pretty nice de-esser. And then a majority of this is from the classic strip preset with a few things changed. So after I did my general tone shaping and stuff like that, I don't know if this is exactly how they meant for you to use it, but I tend to use the FGS to be more of like a surgical EQ. I'm doing a lot of subtraction with it. And then I use the FGN or the Neve style EQ for more broadband stuff like additive EQ, and then maybe some broadband cuts. After that, we're going into FG Stress.
Cross my heart, hope to die.
Which is just decimating the vocal, using a little bit of custom opto after the fact. It's triggering pretty heavily, but I've blended it in just a little bit. It brings us a little bit of a roundness to the vocal, and then just a little bit of shimmer and thickness. I'll show you what it sounds like on and off.
Cross my heart,
So it's on.
hope to die.
Off.
Rather be gone than be alive. In a life without you.
After that, I'm threw it into a little bit of MoTT, just the tiniest bit. I like throwing it on as a very end of the chain thing on like 10% just to give the vocal a little bit of sparkle and tame any of like the weird mid-range stuff that compression might add, because I tend to use compression pretty heavily when I'm doing a track like this. And there's a bit of a give and take with compression where if you make it more aggressive, it tends to bring out a bit more of that like woofiness. So this is just balancing that out a bit. And pretty much all of the chains for the main vocals are the exact same thing. But yeah, I have this one group that is essentially just that exact same chain over various different sections. Because I have a computer that can handle it now, I have them all with their own different chain depending on what they need. But the reason that I do it this way is because in the early days when I didn't have a strong computer, I would just apply the vocal chain to this main group and it would just sort of take care of everything, which makes it really awesome for gain staging as well. Because if you have like a vocal section like this that's not as loud and you want to like level out your signal going into your chain, you can just use the fader here. That's what I used to do. Don't really have to do that anymore. But after that main vocal group, we have these guys, which are the harmonies and the dubs.
Cross my heart, hope to die. Rather be gone than be alive.
I guess now would be a good time to talk about my vocal editing process. I might do a video on it at some later point, but my general framework is I'll bring all of my vocal tracks into something like Reaper that has ARA2 support, which just makes vocal editing faster. Once I get my main vocal sounding exactly how I like it, perfectly tuned, perfectly time aligned, I personally like the sound of the Andrew Wade style way of tuning vocals, which for anyone who doesn't know, he does all the production stuff for A Day to Remember. He actually has a vocal recording course on Creative Live that I highly recommend. Even though it's a bit older, there's some really good concepts in that one. But one thing that he covers in that course is that he actually prefers quantizing his vocals by hand, syllable by syllable, which sounds very tedious, and it kind of is. But once you hear what your vocal sounds like when you've actually like dragged every syllable in every line to fit on the grid, to clarify, not auto quantizing it or anything, like actually like drag it out, it sounds so nice and so clean. But anyway, once you get that first vocal there, it makes it really easy to sort of match all of your dubs in your harmonies to that. I've started using Melodyne for my main vocal because I just enjoy the workflow with it. And after that, I'll use Vocaline to get the timing right on all of my vocals. So as you can hear, even though we have like 8 tracks of vocals,
Cross my heart, hope to die.
they're all perfectly lined up with each other, which is super important for a style like this because it makes it feel like one thick, beefy vocal, which you kind of need if you want it to cut through a mix this dense. But then normally with my backups, in my experience, people aren't as picky with picking out heavy tuning on background vocals. You tend to hear it more in the main vocal. And I would say the main thing for making sure your vocals sound good is making sure your singer has a great vocal performance. And Amanda knocked it out of the park with all of these. This track, I barely had to touch them, honestly. It was just more of like a general control thing. But yeah, for my dubs and my harmonies, I basically use the exact same chain with 2 big exceptions. I tend to use a high shelf cut to sort of reduce that air that they have. And then I'll normally high pass them up a little bit more than the other ones. When I listen to mixes that are vocally dense, I really like to have all of the background vocals and everything almost act like a blanket that just kind of hugs the main vocal, makes it thicker. And in the past, this is just how I've been able to get that sound. I know some people who like it the exact opposite way, like more of an Ariana Grande type thing where you boost the high end and maybe high pass it even more, but this is just how I like it. But yeah, all of these guys are panned, hard left, hard right. In terms of vocal layers, we have our first dub here,
Hope to die.
which is the exact same thing that she is singing in her main vocal. Then we have an octave lower.
Cross my heart, hope to die.
And then we have a single harmony here that's sung about 4 times.
Cross my heart, hope to die.
And then the last thing we have here are these ahs, which sound awesome in the context of the mix. I find when I'm doing something like this, from a writing standpoint, they tend to sound better the more neutral you keep them, unless you want to go full tilt and just sing fully voiced chords for everything, which some people do. But if you want something super quick, super effective, this works perfectly fine. It's basically just a root and a fifth. And then I think it's pedaling back and forth between a third and a second. So we have these first 2, which are just doing the root. Then we have these 2 down here, which is a perfect fifth. You know your perfect fifths because it's the first 2 notes of Star Wars. Da, 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 da. And under that, we have this guy, which are just going back and forth between a third and a second. And all this is voiced as a major chord, by the way. And when you layer all of the vocals together, they sound like this.
Cross my heart, hope to die. Rather be gone than be alive.
Also, for the mixing of these like ah vocals, I just used the same chain as I did for all the other background vocals. But the only thing is I didn't throw this on each individual vocal. I put these ahs into a group, and then I put this single instance on the group because I wanted it to have more of that like live choir feel. And in my experience, it's a little bit easier to get that sound when you're just processing it the way that you would process it if you had a single track of a group singing. Oh, by the way, I should mention I'm using on my reverb send this plate reverb from Arturia on this dark plate preset. I think I made it a little bit shorter and a little less drivey. Then we've also got some H delay on a ping pong setting and some ROM reverb for those sound design elements that need a little bit of a longer reverb. I tend to use this for instruments more than vocals. So let's move on to the not singing parts. So first we have these guitars. I'd say these guys are the more edgier guitars, like the kind of things that you would expect to be in a Paramore song. Again, Archetype Gojira on their heavier amp, lighter gain setting, with some basic EQ and some limiting. The goal with these guitars was to have more of that like chunky rhythm, and that's basically the role that they fulfill throughout a majority of the song. Really only doing a little bit of control here to like tame that woofy low end. And then I personally like to low pass all my electrics just because I feel like that air can be a little bit hissy and it can take up the range that the vocals are supposed to fill up. Underneath those guys, we have the lead, which is basically the same sound, just a little bit drivier. And then we have an Arturia Juno chorus. And they're meant to sort of be like the opposite of what those chunky rhythms are. They're sort of like in your face, like da 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 da. And this is more of like a gentle, soft picking part. It just happens to be played through a really heavy amp so that it's like in your face. As you can see, they're also high passed a lot more. And that sort of lower mid-range woofiness, depending on where you're playing on the guitar, it can actually like move up higher. So you can see it's actually being cut more in like the 600 to 700 range. And that's because this lead part is way higher up on the neck than these guys. And so when you go up an octave, the frequency that you're cutting also goes up double. And then on the tail end, we just have these guys. This is actually like a vocal line from the melody of the song, and it just felt like it needed to be like doubled up with something. So I believe we have this, which is like that lead line, but then we also have an octave lower just to make it a bit thicker. And then as you can see on a lot of these tracks, there's an auto filter, which if we zoom out and I go to the automation lane, you can actually see there's a lot of sections where it's like going up and going down. I feel like an auto filter is a really great way to sort of add dynamics in and out in certain sections of the song, give it that underwater feel. So like when it goes to the bridge, dies down and just slowly rises. And it's like on some level, they're playing the exact same thing the entire length of that buildup and the actual bridge itself after the fact. But it feels like the energy is building because you've taken away that high-end information and you're slowly bringing it back. After that, all of these guitars are going into soothe just because there was a lot of sort of 4K buildup because there were a lot of guitar layers. I probably could have avoided it had I used something like a dynamic EQ on each track, but I just didn't think about it in the moment, and by the end, I was just like, I'll just throw on Soothe. So yeah, we're really cutting that annoying like pick attack in like the 4K range, which tends to be a problem with distorted guitars. And then a little bit of this low-end woofiness. The bass is really heavy in this song, so I didn't want these guitars to be taking up that lower range, but I also didn't want to like high pass it out of them. After that, I did a little bit of saturation just to sort of bring some harmonics to it. Since making this song, I've actually upgraded to using the SPL tube driver, which I like a bit more than this, but this is a free plugin, and I still think that this is an awesome plugin to get if you don't have it already. And then this is around the tail end of my Kramer tape obsession. I'm not using it as much now. It's actually pretty rare for me to use it because I overdid it. But yeah, slow the tape speed down, keep the flux low to keep the distortion lower, and it'll just dampen that upper high end and make it a little bit warmer. And then after all this processing, I felt like I wanted to like high pass it again one last time just because there was a lot of low end information sort of lingering there. It's another thing to remember. Just because you high pass it on these individual tracks, after you do a bunch of compression or harmonic saturation, there might be some lingering lower end frequencies that you still need to high pass. And then after that, we have the bass, which is made of two elements. So I was actually kind of proud of myself for this one. So the main sound we have here is this Music Man bass, which is going through Neural DSP's Parallax on the Dave Otero Punch preset. I really like this one for drivier rock stuff that's not as crazy distorted as the modern metal stuff that you tend to use this for. Throwing it into this DI feeder preset on CLA bass, just to sort of round it out tonally a bit more. And then using some auto filter, again, to filter it in and out of certain sections with some soothe sidechain to the kick. Now, the interesting part about this sound is there's actually a guitar layer. So if I boost it up, this sort of crazy distorted guitar sound is a patch in Neural DSP's Gojira, and I'm using this drop pedal that they have built in and some of the onboard effects to make it really distorted and dirty and bit crushed, and then using some EQ and some OTT and some auto pan to make it really weird, just because I wanted to keep the bass sound that I had, but I also wanted to extend it up a little bit higher because it kind of felt like it was getting buried in the mix. So blending this sound slightly underneath the main bass, it was just a way to make that bass line sort of pop out. So I actually replicated the bass track for the entire song on guitar. But you can hear when I take it out. Bring it in. there's this like weird like almost 6K, 8K sort of thing happening there that you kind of miss when it's not there. But the bass and the guitars are in this group called non-drum/Vox, and it has a compressor sidechain to the kick and the snare in the drum group up here, which we'll get to in a second. But it also has soothe acting in sidechain mode, so the general frequencies of the main vocal are being subtracted from this group. And I really wanted to do that because I feel like this genre is very vocal forward, and I wanted to bring it up as much as possible. So this just kind of pulls out some of like the mid-rangey stuff that might be overwhelming. And then for the drums, I know that this is not what this kit is meant to be used for. This is GGD's Modern Fusion kit, which is part of their One Kit Wonder series. I just used this kit for like the general writing of the song, but by the time we got to the production stage and the mixing stage, every other kit that I tried with the final song just ended up not working. So what I did was I just duplicated this contact instance across multiple channels and then deleted the drum MIDI to just be that one single part of the kit so that I can process them. Please don't do it this way. There's much easier ways that you could do this. But for the vibe of this song, I really liked this kit, and so I couldn't say no. So I basically layered everything up into what is the kick and the snare, and then what's everything else. So I just have the kick here with a little bit of Kramer tape and a little bit of max bass to bring out that sub low end. And then I have the snare down here on a separate channel with that saturation knob again. And both of these are actually being reinforced by these other samples, which are not labeled here, but I believe that they are the Taylor Larson samples. And they're just adding this sort of like gentle reinforcement behind everything. And then I just have the toms here on their own channel. And the main reason that I wanted to bring everything out like this is because the cymbals, I wanted to make them way brighter. Like I went pretty heavy handed with this. And then I wanted to sidechain the cymbals or the overheads or their equivalent of it in this scenario with the kick and the snare. And then I also used soothe to tame it up. And altogether, the drums just... they feel like they just kind of stand on their own, using a little bit of wide drums on this FET compressor just to glue them all together, a little bit of EQ, and then this is a really heavy, drivey, parallel compression style compression, just because I wanted them to be a bit more present. And then I did a little bit of Saturn II to sort of blend those samples in. In my experience, using saturation is a great way to sort of make the samples that you've added in with your kit sound like they're a part of the kit. But yeah, I believe that is everything. The mastering chain was way too intensive to like play on this, so there is no mastering chain. It is the normal one that I use every other video. So if you want to know what I did for mastering, just go watch the previous video. But yeah, let's listen to what everything sounds like together.
Cross my heart, hope to die. Rather be gone than be alive. In a life without you. Cross my heart, hope to die.
And yeah, that's what it sounds like. If you've gotten to this point, I would highly suggest hitting subscribe because you probably enjoy this kind of content. Again, I do one of these videos every Friday, so if you like it, hit the subscribe button and the bell icon and all that stuff. And then here's a video that YouTube thinks that you should watch for my channel. But yeah, I will see you guys next week.